coffee stains on a beige carpet look remarkably like dried blood if you stare at them long enough. Olivia was staring. The mug had slipped from her fingers exactly 12 minutes ago, shattering near the baseboard, sending lukewarm Colombian roast splattering across the living room rug. She hadn't moved to clean it up. Her hands were still suspended in the air, trembling lightly, as if she were trying to hold an invisible ball. Simon was packing. The sound of his heavy, frantic footsteps upstairs vibrated through the plaster ceiling. Thump, drag, thump, drag. He was pulling the vintage leather suitcase, the one she bought him for their 5th anniversary in Florence, out from under the bed. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she couldn't quite muster the energy to laugh. Her mouth tasted like old pennies and ash. "I didn't want to do it like this," Simon had said 20 minutes prior, standing in the doorway with his coat still on. He hadn't even taken off his shoes. He tracked damp city grit onto the hardwood, shifting his weight from left to right. He looked annoyed, not devastated, not guilty, annoyed. As if dismantling a 7-year marriage was a tedious administrative task keeping him from a lunch reservation. Then he slid the manila envelope onto the kitchen island. The paper was heavy textured, the kind of expensive cardstock that screamed billable hours. "It's just, we've been ghosts for a year, Olivia. You know that. Jess makes me feel awake." Jess, the 24-year-old junior copywriter at his firm. The girl who smelled like artificial vanilla and wore oversized vintage sweaters that cost more than Olivia's first car. Olivia finally blinked, pulling her eyes away from the brown stain on the carpet. She touched her own face. Her skin was freezing clammy. She wasn't weeping. That was the strange part. She had always assumed that if this moment ever came, she would scream, throw heavy ceramic objects, collapse into a puddle of cinematic grief. Instead, she just felt violently nauseous. A sour heat churned in her stomach, rising to her throat. She swallowed it down. Simon came down the stairs. The leather suitcase bumped against the banister, leaving a faint white scuff mark on the dark wood. He dragged it to the front door and paused, looking at Olivia. He had the nerve to look pitiful. His shoulders slumped beneath his tailored charcoal suit. "The papers are standard," Simon said, his voice dropping into that soothing, placating tone he used on difficult clients. "I'm not trying to ruin you. I've left you the SUV. I'll keep the house, obviously, since my equity pays the mortgage. I'm being fair, Olivia. Just sign them. Don't make this a bloodbath." He was leaving her the 6-year-old car with the rattling transmission. He was taking the house. The house she had put the initial $70,000 down payment on before he got his big promotion. "Awake," Olivia croaked. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. It was the first word she had spoken since he walked in. Simon flinched, adjusting his grip on the suitcase handle. "What? You said Jess makes you feel awake, like I'm a sedative." Olivia stood up. Her knees popped in the quiet room. She walked toward the kitchen island, her bare feet sticking slightly to the damp floorboards near the front door. She picked up the thick envelope. It smelled like toner ink and stale office air. "You're leaving, today, after handing me a legal eviction notice from my own life." "Olivia, be reasonable. Get out!" She didn't shout. The words just fell out of her mouth, flat and dead, like stones dropping into mud. Simon sighed, a sharp, exasperated sound through his nose. He checked his watch. A stainless steel diver's watch he bought when he closed the Miller account. "My lawyer will call you. Please just get representation, someone cheap. Don't waste our savings dragging this out." He pulled the front door open. The sharp metallic smell of impending rain washed into the hallway, slicing through the heavy, stagnant air of the house. He stepped out, and the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him with quiet finality. Olivia stood in the silence. The refrigerator hummed its low, droning note. A car drove past outside tires hissing on the wet asphalt. She looked down at the envelope in her hands. She opened it. The legalese was dense a labyrinth of heretofore and party of the first part. But the numbers were perfectly cruelly clear. He wasn't just divorcing her, he was erasing her. He was claiming almost the entirety of their shared assets, citing her freelance consulting work as unstable, and claiming primary financial responsibility for their lifestyle. He was leaving her with nothing but a depreciating vehicle and a nominal insulting lump sum that wouldn't cover 6 months of rent in a decent neighborhood. She walked into the downstairs half-bathroom, gripping the edge of the porcelain sink. She stared into the mirror. Her brown hair was tied up in a messy, fraying knot. She looked tired. Her eyes were bloodshot, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. A sudden sharp giggle escaped her lips. Then another. It was an ugly, broken sound. He told her to get a lawyer, someone cheap. Olivia turned on the cold water, cupped her hands, and splashed her face. The freezing shock of it snapped something into place behind her ribs. The numbness receded, leaving behind a cold, crystalline fury. It wasn't a hot, screaming anger. It was the quiet, dangerous anger of a woman who realizes she has been taken for a fool by a man who isn't half as smart as he thinks he is. She walked back to the kitchen, grabbed her phone from the counter, and dried her wet hands on her jeans. She unlocked the screen and scrolled past the messages from friends, past the ignored emails down to the bottom of her contacts. She stopped at a name she hadn't called in 3 years. Harrison. Rain battered the large bay window of the living room, blurring the streetlights into streaks of sickly yellow. The apartment was completely dark, save for the blue, sterile glow of Olivia's phone screen illuminating her face. She had been sitting cross-legged on the floor for 3 hours. The divorce papers were spread out around her like a morbid picnic. She had read every page, every clause, tracing the aggressive, jagged lines of Simon's signature. He had signed it in blue ink, confident, unwavering. Olivia traced the name on her screen. Harrison Croft. To the business world, Harrison Croft was a corporate ghost story. A man who bought distressed companies, gutted them with surgical precision, and sold the organs to the highest bidder. He didn't just practice law, he wielded it like a blunt instrument. He was a billionaire, a titan of ruthless litigation, a man who charged more per hour than Olivia made in a month. To Olivia, he was just Uncle Harrison, her mother's older brother. They weren't close. Harrison was entirely consumed by his empire, residing in a penthouse fortress downtown, surrounded by art he didn't look at and people he didn't trust. He had paid for Olivia's college tuition silently through a trust fund administrator, never asking for a thank you. He attended her mother's funeral, stood stiffly in a bespoke black suit, paid for the entire burial, and left before the reception. When Olivia married, Simon Harrison hadn't attended. He had sent a crystal vase and a brief card that read, "Marriage is a contract. Ensure you read the fine print." Olivia stared at the card in her memory. She let out a ragged breath, the sound loud in the empty, rain-swept house. She tapped the call button. The phone rang twice. It didn't go to an assistant. Harrison insisted on carrying a personal line that bypassed his defensive perimeter of secretaries. "Olivia," a voice answered. It was a deep, resonant baritone, gravelly like crushed stone. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded like he was reading her name off a spreadsheet. "Uncle Harrison," Olivia said. Her voice cracked. She hated herself for it. She cleared her throat, digging her fingernails into her palm. I hope I'm not interrupting." "It's 8:40 on a Tuesday. I am reviewing a merger that bores me to tears." "You are a welcome distraction," Harrison replied. The faint clinking of ice against crystal echoed through the receiver. "You haven't called since you asked for advice on your mother's estate. You are breathing shallowly. You are distressed." "Simon is leaving me," she said. Saying it out loud made it real. The words tasted metallic. Silence stretched on the other end of the line. Olivia could hear the rain hitting her window, and underneath that, the microscopic hum of the cellular connection. "I see," Harrison finally said. There was no pity in his voice. Pity was a useless currency to Harrison Croft. "And I presume, given your call to me rather than a therapist, that he has presented you with a highly unfavorable dissolution agreement." "He wants the house," Olivia said, staring at the papers on the rug. "He wants to buy me out for $30,000. He claims the down payment was a gift from my savings to our joint account, making it communal property he's offsetting against his retirement fund. He left me his old car. He is attempting a financial starvation tactic." Harrison noted his tone, clinical, as if diagnosing a minor engine fault. "Who is representing him, Some guy named Greg Vance. No, wait, Gregson. Someone from a mid-size firm downtown." Harrison snorted. It was a dry, dismissive sound. "Ambulance chasers with better suits. Did he advise you to get cheap counsel?" "Yes. He said not to waste our savings dragging this out." "Predictable. He relies on your emotional exhaustion. He hopes you will sign to make the pain stop." A pause. A heavy-weighted silence. "Do you want to make the pain stop, Olivia? Or do you want to make him bleed?" Olivia swallowed hard. She looked at the scuff mark Simon's suitcase had left on the banister. She thought of Jess sitting in the passenger seat of Simon's pristine Audi, wearing her expensive vintage sweater. She thought of the 7 years she had spent managing Simon's anxieties, building his confidence, deferring her own career so he could make partner. "I want the house," Olivia whispered, her voice tightening, dropping an octave. "I want my money. And I want him to look me in the eye and realize he can't throw me away like a broken appliance." "Good. Anger is useful. Tears are not." Harrison's voice sharpened, shifting from an uncle to a general. "Do not sign anything. Do not text him. Do not call him. If he comes to the house, you lock the door and call the police. You are to communicate exclusively through counsel, starting right now." I can't afford you, Uncle Harrison. I know your retainer is—" "Do not insult me," Harrison interrupted smoothly. "You are my sister's child. I do not bill family. Furthermore, I despise petty, arrogant men who mistake cruelty for intelligence. Send me the PDF of the papers. Take photos of them now." Right now, Olivia. Then pour yourself a glass of whatever alcohol is in your kitchen, drink it, and go to sleep. Tomorrow your husband will realize he has stepped off a cliff. He just hasn't looked down yet." The line went dead. Olivia sat there for a long moment, the dial tone buzzing softly against her ear. The cold knot in her chest hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a heavy weight of despair. It was a jagged edge of anticipation. She stood up, her joints aching, and walked to the kitchen. She found a half-empty bottle of bourbon Simon had left behind. She didn't bother with a glass. She took a long, burning swallow straight from the bottle, welcoming the fire in her throat, She picked up her phone and started taking pictures of the documents. The conference room of Gregson and Associates smelled aggressively of lemon pledge and cheap stale coffee. The walls were constructed of frosted glass, giving the illusion of transparency while hiding the mediocre reality within. It was exactly the kind of place Simon would choose: superficially impressive, functionally cheap. Olivia sat at the edge of the long faux mahogany table. She wore a tailored navy blazer she hadn't touched since her consulting days, her hair pulled back into a severe, sleek knot. She hadn't slept well, but she had meticulously applied concealer to hide the dark circles. She was entirely motionless. Across from her sat Simon. He looked relaxed, an arrogant slant to his posture. He wore a light gray suit and a condescending smile. Next to him sat his lawyer, Greg. Greg had slicked back hair, an overly tanned face, and wore too much cologne, a musky, peppery scent that made Olivia want to sneeze. "It's good to see you being so cooperative, Olivia," Simon said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I know this is hard, but it's for the best. We can both move on. Let's get down to brass tacks," Greg interjected, slapping a thick folder onto the table. He didn't look at Olivia. He looked at his watch. "My client is being exceedingly generous here. A $30,000 lump sum immediate transfer of the title for the Ford Explorer. In exchange, you waive all rights to the property on Elm Street, his 401k, and any future alimony. It's clean. It's fast. We just need your signature." Olivia didn't move. She stared at Simon's hands. He was tapping a gold pen against the table. Tap, tap, tap. "My counsel is running a few minutes late," Olivia said quietly. Simon sighed an exaggerated puff of air. "Olivia, I told you bringing some strip mall lawyer into this is just going to cost you out of your settlement. Greg here is going to run circles around whoever you hired. Just sign it. Jess and I are looking at new furniture today. I have a schedule." The mention of Jess was deliberate. A little twist of the knife to remind her of her replacement, to break her composure. Olivia felt a spike of adrenaline hot and sharp behind her ribs, but she kept her face perfectly blank. "He'll be here," she said. Greg chuckled, opening a tin of breath mints. "Look, lady, we have the financial records. You're a freelancer. My client is a senior partner. You have no leverage. Whoever you hired is going to look at this paperwork, realize we've cornered you, and tell you to take the deal. Save yourself the hourly rate." As the words left Greg's mouth, the heavy glass door of the conference room clicked open. The air in the room seemed to change instantly. The ambient hum of the building's AC unit suddenly felt very loud. Harrison Croft stepped into the room. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a bespoke dark charcoal three-piece that looked like it had been sculpted out of shadow. He was 62 years old, tall, with silver hair combed back with mathematical precision. His eyes, a pale, icy blue, swept the room in a fraction of a second, cataloging and dismissing Greg and Simon instantly. He carried a slim, worn leather briefcase that likely cost more than Greg's entire car. He didn't apologize for being late. He walked to the empty chair beside Olivia, unbuttoned his jacket with one hand, and sat down. The leather chair let out a low, intimidated creak. "I despise Midtown traffic," Harrison said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a terrifying gravity. It was the voice of a man who was never interrupted. He placed the briefcase on the table. Click, click. The brass lock snapped open. Greg frowned, sitting up straighter. "And you are—" "I am Olivia's legal counsel," Harrison said, extracting a single sheet of paper from his briefcase. He didn't look at Greg. He looked directly at Simon. Simon's arrogant smile had frozen on his face, morphing into a look of vague, creeping confusion. "Well, mister," Greg prompted, puffing out his chest. "Croft," Harrison said softly. "Harrison Croft, of Croft, Vance, and Sterling." The blood drained out of Greg's tanned face so fast it was comical. His jaw went slack. Croft, Vance, and Sterling wasn't a law firm. It was an institution. It was the firm that handled antitrust lawsuits for tech monopolies. The firm that destroyed international conglomerates before lunch. "Harrison, Croft," Greg stammered, looking frantically from Harrison to Olivia. You don't do family law." "I do whatever I please," Harrison replied, sliding the single sheet of paper across the table. It came to a stop perfectly centered in front of Simon. "And currently, it pleases me to protect my niece from a pathetic attempt at financial extortion." Simon blinked rapidly, his eyes darting to Olivia. "Niece Olivia, what is he talking about? Your uncle is a businessman." "My uncle," Olivia said, her voice finally steady, finally strong, "is Harrison. I thought you knew that, Simon. You always said you paid so much attention to me." Simon stared at the piece of paper on the table. He looked terrified. "What is this?" Greg asked, his voice an octave higher than it had been a minute ago. His hands hovered over the paper as if it were radioactive. "That," Harrison said, folding his hands neatly on the table, "is a formal notice of discovery. We are not accepting your settlement. We are demanding a full forensic audit of my nephew-in-law's finances. Every offshore account, every cryptocurrency wallet, every undeclared bonus he has hidden from his wife for the past 4 years. Simon choked. "Hidden Do not lie to me, Mr. Miller," Harrison interrupted. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You routed $80,000 through a shell LLC in Delaware 3 months before asking for this divorce. You bought a diamond tennis bracelet for a Miss Jessica Vance last Tuesday, billing it as a client entertainment expense through your firm. That is corporate fraud, marital dissipation of assets, and remarkably stupid." Simon looked at Greg. Greg was staring at the table, completely paralyzed. He knew exactly who Harrison Croft was. He knew his career could be ended with a single phone call from the man sitting across from him. "Now," Harrison said, leaning back in his chair, a razor-thin smile touching his lips. "We are going to start over, and this time you are going to bleed." Olivia watched Simon's hands start to shake. The heavy, nauseous weight that had been sitting in her stomach for 24 hours dissolved, replaced by a cold, thrilling rush of adrenaline. She looked at her husband, the man who had discarded her like trash, and saw exactly what he was: small and trapped. Cardboard dust settled in Olivia's throat like powdered chalk. She dragged another flattened Home Depot box from the pile, folding the flaps down with the heel of her hand. The packing tape gun let out a violent mechanical screech that echoed off the bare walls of the guest room. It had been 4 days since the meeting at Gregson's office. 4 days since Uncle Harrison had dropped a tactical nuke on Simon's meticulously curated reality. Olivia wrapped a ceramic lamp in bubble wrap, her fingers moving with a numb, automated rhythm. The house was half empty, yet it felt heavier. Every object she touched held a radioactive memory. The Dutch oven they bought after their first big fight. The mismatched bookends from a flea market in Portland. Dismantling a marriage wasn't a single explosive event. It was 1,000 tiny, agonizing amputations. Her phone buzzed against the hardwood floor, vibrating loudly. She ignored it. It buzzed again and again. She finally rocked back on her heels, wiping a streak of sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. The caller ID was a string of unknown numbers. Simon had been calling her twice an hour for the last 48 hours, cycling through different phones after Harrison's firm had legally mandated all communication go through counsel. Olivia picked it up and hit accept, not putting it to her ear, just holding it in front of her face on speaker. "Olivia, oh my God, Olivia, please don't hang up." Simon's voice was a ragged, wet gasp. The smooth, placating tone of the senior partner was entirely gone. He sounded like a man who had been running up a very steep hill. She didn't speak. She just listened to the harsh sound of his breathing coming through the tiny speaker. "They froze my checking account." Simon stammered the words, tumbling over each other. "Your uncle, his people. They got an emergency injunction. My cards are declining. I tried to buy gas this morning, and the machine told me to surrender the plastic. Olivia, I can't even pay for my hotel." A sharp, unexpected pang of sympathy flared in Olivia's chest. It was an old reflex carved into her nervous system by 7 years of managing Simon's crises. When he failed his first bar exam, she had been the one to hold him while he cried into the sofa cushions. When he lost a client, she poured the scotch and rubbed the tension from his shoulders. Her body instinctively wanted to soothe him. She looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were white-coated in a fine layer of dust. "You should call your lawyer Simon," Olivia said. Her voice sounded foreign to her flat hollow, scraped clean of emotion. "Greg dropped me," Simon's voice cracked, pitching upward into a whine. "He said he's not equipped for corporate forensic litigation. He practically shoved me out of his office. Olivia Harrison has 5 accountants going through my firm's server architecture. My managing partner called me into his office. They're looking at my expense reports, the bracelet, the dinners with Jess." He paused, swallowing audibly. "They might fire me, Olivia, for embezzlement." The air in the guest room suddenly felt very still. Olivia closed her eyes. The smell of the packing tape, sharp and chemical, burned her nostrils. "It wasn't embezzlement," Simon pleaded, sounding exactly like a cornered teenager. "It was aggressive restructuring of my personal draw. Everyone does it, but your uncle is painting it like I stole from the firm to hide it from you. Please, just call him off. We can settle. You can keep the house. I'll give you whatever you want." He was bargaining. 3 days ago, he was tossing her the keys to a rattling 6-year-old car and telling her to disappear quietly. Now he was bleeding out, begging for a tourniquet. "You didn't aggressively restructure Simon," Olivia said, quietly, opening her eyes. "You funneled $80,000 into a shell company so you could starve me out of our divorce. You bought another woman diamonds with money we saved together. I made a mistake. I was confused. Jess, she manipulated the situation. She made me feel like I needed to impress her." Olivia actually laughed, a short, dry sound that scraped the back of her throat. It was the cowardice that finally killed whatever lingering affection she held for him. He couldn't even own his betrayal. He was throwing the 24-year-old girl under the bus the second the ride got bumpy. "Where is Jess now?" Olivia asked. Silence hung on the line, a heavy, suffocating silence. "She went to stay with her parents," Simon whispered, his voice cracking. "She said she needed space because of the audit. She didn't want her name in the depositions." "I see." Olivia picked up the tape gun. "Call your new lawyer, Simon. Don't call this number again." She ended the call, tossed the phone onto the mattress, and ripped a long strip of tape across the cardboard box. The screech of the adhesive was loud, aggressive, and strangely satisfying. Rain fell in thick, greasy sheets, turning the suburban street into a glossy black mirror. Olivia sat by the front window, wrapped in an oversized wool cardigan, watching the droplets race down the glass. The house was mostly dark. She had canceled the cable and the internet 2 days ago. There was a profound, eerie quiet to the empty rooms. It was 11:30 at night. Headlights swept across the living room wall, harsh and sudden. A car had pulled into the driveway. It wasn't the pristine Audi Simon loved so much. It was a dented yellow cab. Olivia didn't move. She just watched as the cab idled its wipers, thumping rhythmically. The back door opened, and a figure stepped out into the downpour. Simon. He didn't have an umbrella. He was wearing the same charcoal suit he had worn to Greg's office, but it was ruined. The fabric was soaked, clinging to his frame, the shoulders dark with rain. His tie was missing. His collar was unbuttoned, hanging loosely around his neck. He walked up the driveway, his steps heavy and uneven. He looked up at the house, staring at the single dim lamp glowing in the living room window. Olivia stood up. Her bare feet made no sound on the floorboards as she walked to the front door. She didn't open it. She engaged the deadbolt with a solid metallic clack, then leaned her forehead against the cool wood. The doorbell rang. Once, twice. Then came the knocking. "Olivia!" His voice was muffled through the heavy oak door. "Olivia, I know you're in there. I saw the light." She smelled it even through the door gap, the sour metallic stench of cheap gin and old sweat. "Go home, Simon," Olivia said, raising her voice just enough to carry through the wood. "I don't have a home," he slurred, pressing his weight against the door. The wood groaned slightly. "The hotel locked me out. The card bounced. I don't have any cash. Jess blocked my number." Olivia squeezed her eyes shut. A wave of profound, bone-deep exhaustion washed over her. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel like a mastermind. She just felt tired. Looking at a man she had shared a bed with for 7 years, reduced to a wet, shivering stray dog on her porch, didn't bring her joy. It just felt gross, grimy. "Call a friend," Olivia said. "Call your brother in Chicago." "They won't answer," Simon choked out. He sounded like he was crying. "Harrison sent them preservation notices. Everyone thinks I'm toxic. My firm put me on indefinite unpaid leave pending the internal investigation. Olivia, I have $54 to my name." He slid down the other side of the door. Olivia could hear the wet friction of his suit jacket against the wood, followed by a heavy thud as he sat on the porch mat. "You won," Simon whispered through the crack beneath the door. "Are you happy you completely destroyed me?" Olivia's eyes snapped open. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. She unlocked the deadbolt and yanked the door open. The rush of cold, wet air hit her face. Simon looked up, blinking against the harsh yellow glare of the porch light. He looked horrific. His skin was gray, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with purple shadows. Water dripped from his nose and chin, mixing with tears he wasn't bothering to wipe away. "I didn't destroy you," Olivia said, her voice dropping into a register she had never used before. Low, steady, absolute. "I just stopped protecting you from yourself." Simon stared at her, his mouth hanging slightly open. For 7 years, Olivia continued leaning against the door frame, crossing her arms over her chest to keep the chill out. "I managed your schedule. I managed your ego. I managed our finances so you could pretend you were a master of the universe. When you handed me those divorce papers, you didn't just fire your wife. You fired your safety net. I was stupid, he sobbed, burying his face in his hands. I miss you. I miss our life. You don't miss me, Olivia corrected gently, stating a fact rather than an insult. You miss the convenience of me. You miss having someone clean up your messes. Jess didn't want to clean up your messes. She just wanted the clean, shiny version of you that I built. Simon flinched as if she had kicked him. He looked up at her, searching her face for any trace of the soft, forgiving woman he had married. He found nothing. Her face was a mask of polite indifference. Please, he whispered. Can I just come in just to dry off? I'll sleep on the floor. Olivia looked at his wet clothes, the puddle forming around his shoes on the concrete. The old Olivia would have brought him a towel. The old Olivia would have made a pot of decaf coffee and let him explain away his sins. No, Olivia said. She stepped back inside. Olivia, wait. She closed the door. She didn't slam it. She shut it firmly, pushing the heavy wood into the frame until it clicked. She turned the deadbolt. Then she reached up and turned off the porch light, plunging the other side of the door into absolute darkness. She stood in the foyer for a long time, listening to the rain. After 10 minutes, she heard the wet, shuffling sound of footsteps retreating down the driveway. The conference room at Croft Vance and Sterling did not smell like Lemon Pledge. It smelled like ancient oak ozone and terrifying amounts of money. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city skyline, rendering the cars below into insignificant crawling insects. Olivia sat at the center of an enormous black marble table. She wore a tailored black suit. It was sharp, severe armor. The chair beneath her was ergonomic perfection, designed to make the occupant feel anchored, powerful. Across the vast expanse of marble sat Simon. He looked like a deflated balloon. His suit was clean, but it hung loosely on his frame, suggesting he had lost a significant amount of weight in the past 3 weeks. Beside him sat his new attorney, a man named Robert. Robert was in his late 50s, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a permanent expression of deep regret. He had the posture of a man walking into a firing squad. Harrison Croft entered the room. He didn't carry a briefcase this time. He just carried a single thick manila folder. He moved with the predatory grace of a great white shark gliding through warm water. He took the seat next to Olivia, placed the folder on the table, and tapped it once with his index finger. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly soundproofed room. "Good morning," Harrison said. His voice was a velvet rasp. He didn't offer to shake hands. Robert cleared his throat, adjusting his collar. It looked tight. "Mr. Croft, we've reviewed your latest proposal. We are prepared to concede on the primary issues." "You are prepared to surrender," Harrison corrected smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "Concession implies you had leverage to begin with. You do not." Simon kept his eyes glued to the marble table. He couldn't even look at Olivia. "Let us review the anatomy of this corpse," Harrison said, opening the folder. He produced a pair of reading glasses, sliding them onto his nose. The lenses caught the light from the window, turning his eyes into opaque white screens. "The Elm Street property. The title will be transferred entirely to my niece by Friday. You will vacate any remaining personal effects by tomorrow at noon under the supervision of private security, the cost of which will be deducted from your remaining liquid assets." Simon flinched but didn't speak. "The joint savings accounts, the mutual funds, and the Vanguard portfolio." Harrison continued, his voice an emotionless metronome. My forensic team found the $84,000 you attempted to hide in the Delaware LLC. Because you attempted to defraud your spouse during active divorce proceedings, a judge would look upon you with extreme prejudice. Therefore, you are forfeiting 100% of those accounts to Olivia. Mr. Croft, Robert interjected weakly, raising a hand. My client must have some living expenses. Stripping him of all liquidity it's punitive. Harrison slowly lowered his glasses, looking over the rims at Robert. The temperature in the room plummeted. Robert, your client engaged in marital fraud. He utilized company funds to purchase jewelry for a subordinate. My firm currently possesses a 70-page audit detailing 5 years of his creative accounting. If this goes to open court, I will not merely take his money, I will take his law license. I will ensure he is federally indicted. Does he wish to test my resolve? Robert swallowed hard, looking down at his notepad. No, Mr. Croft. We accept the division of assets. Excellent. Harrison flipped a page. Now regarding alimony, Simon finally snapped. His head shot up, his face pale and twisted. Alimony. She has a job. She's getting the house. She's getting the savings. I'm ruined. Harrison, I have nothing left. Harrison didn't blink. You have a pulse, Simon. Everything else is negotiable. However, Olivia has graciously decided to waive alimony. Simon froze his mouth half open in a silent protest. He blinked, confused, looking at Olivia for the first time. Olivia looked back at him. Her face was perfectly still. She wasn't doing it out of kindness. She was doing it out of disgust. She didn't want a monthly check tying her to this man for the next decade. She didn't want his money dripping into her account, a constant reminder of his existence. She wanted a clean amputation. She waives alimony. Harrison continued sliding a heavy stack of stapled papers across the marble table toward Robert. In exchange for you assuming total responsibility for all debts accrued during the marriage, including the remaining balance on her student loans, and naturally the entirety of my firm's legal fees for this negotiation. Robert blanched, staring at the number on the final page of the document. Mr. Croft, your firm's billable hours for a forensic audit of this scale. This is 6 figures, Harrison supplied helpfully. Yes, I suggest your client liquidates his retirement account. Or perhaps he can sell his Audi. I understand it has a very nice stereo system. Simon looked like he was going to vomit. He stared at the papers, his hands trembling violently. He picked up the heavy metal pen provided by his lawyer. It looked too heavy for him to hold. Sign it, Simon, Robert whispered miserably. Simon looked at Olivia. Are you really going to do this to me? He asked, his voice barely a breath. You're taking everything. You told me to get a lawyer, Olivia said, her voice calm, clear, and perfectly steady. Someone cheap. You told me not to make it a bloodbath. She leaned forward, resting her arms on the cool marble. I just followed your advice, Simon. I made it a slaughter. Simon stared at her for a long, agonizing second. Then he looked down, pressed the pen to the paper, and signed his name. It wasn't the confident, aggressive signature from the first set of divorce papers. It was a jagged, broken scrawl, a white flag waving over a crater. Harrison took the papers back, checking the signatures with clinical efficiency. A pleasure doing business with you, gentlemen. The security team will meet you at the house tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp. Simon stood up. He didn't say goodbye. He walked out of the conference room, his shoulders slumped, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Robert scurried after him, clutching his briefcase like a shield. The heavy glass door swung shut, sealing the silence back into the room. Olivia sat still. She looked down at her own hands. They weren't shaking. Harrison closed the folder. He took off his glasses and looked at his niece. The terrifying predatory aura dissolved, leaving behind a tired older man in an expensive suit. "How do you feel?" Harrison asked quietly. Olivia took a slow, deep breath. She thought about the empty house. She thought about the money sitting in her accounts. She thought about Simon stepping into an elevator to go down to a life he had completely shattered. "I feel," Olivia said, looking out the massive window at the city stretching out below them, "like I need a very strong drink and a new sofa." Harrison Croft's lips twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on his face. "I know a place," he said, standing up. "My treat." Paint fumes burned the back of Olivia's throat, a sharp chemical tang that smelled aggressively like a fresh start. She pushed the heavy roller up the drywall, listening to the sticky tearing sound it made as thick white primer obliterated the dark navy accent wall. Simon had insisted on that navy wall. He claimed it gave the dining room a bespoke masculine energy, perfectly suited for hosting the senior partners. Olivia used to hate it, but she had lived with it, letting it swallow the natural light from the bay window just to keep the peace. Her shoulders ached. Her knuckles were stiff and dusted with white specks. She was wearing sweatpants with a hole in the knee and an oversized t-shirt she'd pulled from the bottom of a donation bag. She looked like a wreck, and for the first time in 7 years, she didn't care who saw her. She paused, resting the roller in the plastic tray. The house was painfully quiet. Without the Persian rugs, the heavy leather sofas, and Simon's constant nervous pacing, the acoustics had changed. Every footstep echoed. Every breath felt amplified. She sat down on the canvas drop cloth, pulling a lukewarm slice of pepperoni pizza from a greasy cardboard box on the floor. She bit into it. The cheese was rubbery. It was the best thing she had ever tasted, but the victory wasn't clean. That was the cruelest joke of divorce. The enemy was gone, the territory was reclaimed, but the phantom limb syndrome remained. As she chewed, her eyes drifted to the corner where Simon's armchair used to sit. For a fraction of a second, her brain expected to see him there, scrolling through his emails, ignoring her. A sudden violent sob ripped out of her chest, entirely unprompted. Olivia dropped the pizza. She pulled her knees to her chest and wept. It wasn't a pretty cinematic cry. It was ugly. Her nose ran, her chest heaved, and she gasped for air in the empty, paint-fumed room. She wasn't crying for Simon. She was mourning the girl who had spent her late 20s walking on eggshells, shrinking herself down to fit into the margins of an arrogant man's life. She cried for the sheer exhausting waste of it all. When she finally stopped, her head pounded, and her eyes felt like they were packed with hot sand. She wiped her face with the back of her paint-stained hand, smearing a streak of primer across her cheek. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The air smelled like chemicals and old grease. She picked up the roller and went back to work. Across the city, in a neighborhood where the streetlights buzzed with a sickly orange hue, Simon was leaning against the vibrating metal of a commercial washing machine. The laundromat smelled like industrial bleach, damp lint, and stale cigarette smoke. He stared through the scratched circular glass at his clothes tumbling in the suds. His white button-downs were turning a dingy, bruised gray. He hadn't bothered to separate the colors. He didn't know how. Olivia had always done the dry cleaning. Simon shivered. The heating in the laundromat was broken, and the November wind rattled the large, dirty front windows. He was wearing a faded college sweatshirt he hadn't touched in a decade, the cuffs frayed and hanging loosely around his wrists. He had lost 15 pounds. His face looked hollowed out, the skin sagging slightly around his jawline, the arrogant spark in his eyes completely extinguished. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. The screen was spider-webbed with cracks. He had dropped it running for the bus 2 weeks ago and couldn't afford the $70 repair fee. It was an automated text alert from his bank. Your balance has dropped below $50. Simon squeezed his eyes shut, leaning his forehead against the cold metal of the washing machine. He hadn't lost his law license, but Harrison Croft's quiet, ruthless influence had poisoned the well. No reputable firm in the city would touch him. He was currently employed at a strip mall practice squeezed between a pawn shop and a discount liquor store. His new boss was a 28-year-old named Todd, who wore cheap, overpowering cologne and exclusively handled DUIs and slip-and-fall cases. Simon spent 10 hours a day in a windowless back room, proofreading boilerplate settlement letters on a computer that hummed loudly and occasionally froze. He opened a social media app, an old masochistic habit he couldn't break. He typed a name into the search bar. Jess. Her profile loaded. She was smiling, leaning against the rail of a yacht, wearing a massive dark lens pair of sunglasses. A man's arm was wrapped around her waist. He looked to be in his late 40s, wearing a tailored linen shirt, possessing the kind of effortless wealth Simon had spent his entire life trying to fake. The caption read, "Weekend getaway with my rock." A sour burning sensation rose in Simon's throat. It tasted like bile and cheap coffee. He locked the phone and shoved it back into his pocket. The washing machine beeped a shrill digital scream, signaling the end of the cycle. Simon pulled the heavy wet knot of clothes from the drum. He hauled it toward the dryers, his cheap sneakers squeaking on the sticky linoleum floor. He was 34 years old, drowning in debt, living in a studio apartment that smelled like boiled cabbage, and completely, utterly alone. He fed his last 3 quarters into the dryer. He watched the gray shirt spin, realizing with a cold, terrifying certainty that this wasn't a temporary setback. This was the rest of his life. Spring arrived in the city not with a gentle thaw, but with a sudden violent crack of sunlight that baked the damp chill out of the pavement. Olivia sat at a small wrought iron table on the patio of a high-end bistro in the financial district. She wore a tailored linen blazer in a soft olive green, the fabric crisp and cool against her skin. Her hair, once constantly pulled back in an anxious knot, was cut into a sharp grazing bob. She looked over the rim of her sparkling water, watching the busy pedestrian traffic flow past. She checked her watch. It was a vintage Cartier, understated and immaculate. She had bought it for herself the day she finalized the lease on her new office space. "You're early," a gravelly voice noted. Olivia looked up. Harrison Croft was standing by the table, pulling out the opposite chair. He wore a navy suit with a subtle pinstripe, moving with the same intimidating grace that made boardrooms hold their breath. "I control my own schedule now," Olivia said, offering a faint, easy smile. "I can afford to be early." Harrison sat down. A waiter appeared, instantly poured him a glass of ice water without asking, and vanished. "A dangerous luxury," Harrison murmured, pulling a thick manila folder from his leather briefcase and setting it on the table. "How is the independent consulting business? I assume you are not starving, judging by the blazer." "I closed the tech startup account yesterday," Olivia replied, taking a sip of her water. The carbonation popped pleasantly on her tongue. "I'm managing their entire internal restructuring. They pay on time, and they don't ask me to fetch their coffee. Competence usually commands a premium," Harrison said. He tapped the manila folder. "Which brings us to this, a mid-sized logistics firm in the valley. They are hemorrhaging money due to severe internal mismanagement. They need an architect to rebuild their operational flow. I recommended you. Olivia stared at the folder. The thick, creamy cardstock looked heavy. She didn't reach for it immediately. She looked at her uncle. His icy blue eyes were unreadable, but there was a distinct lack of the condescension he usually reserved for the rest of humanity. "You're referring a client to me," Olivia stated carefully, stripping the surprise from her voice. "I am securing a vital service for a subsidiary I have a vested interest in," Harrison corrected smoothly. "I do not perform acts of charity, Olivia. You survived a brutal personal liquidation. You secured your assets. You demonstrated an appetite for the throat when necessary. You are no longer a liability. You are an asset." It was the highest compliment Harrison Croft could bestow. It wasn't warm. It wasn't loving. But it was profoundly, deeply validating. Olivia reached across the table and pulled the folder toward her. The paper felt rough and substantial beneath her fingertips. "I'll review the financials tonight. My retainer is $20,000. Harrison's mouth twitched at the corner. "Send the invoice to my assistant." They ordered lunch. They didn't talk about Simon. They didn't talk about the past. They talked about profit margins, tax codes, and the structural integrity of corporate contracts. For the first time in her life, Olivia didn't feel like she was performing. She wasn't playing the supportive wife, and she wasn't playing the grieving victim. She was just sitting in the sun, existing entirely on her own terms. After lunch, they parted ways on the sidewalk. Harrison gave her a brief, rigid nod before slipping into the back of a waiting town car. Olivia walked 3 blocks to the parking garage. The air smelled of hot asphalt and roasting coffee beans from a nearby cafe. She walked past rows of gleaming, expensive sedans and stopped in front of a sensible, slightly dusty 6-year-old Ford Explorer. She hadn't sold the car. She had used the settlement money to replace the rattling transmission, fix the AC, and put on 4 brand new tires. It wasn't a status symbol. It was a machine that worked completely owned and operated by her. She unlocked it, the heavy door groaning slightly on its hinges. She slid into the driver's seat. The interior smelled like old leather and the faint lingering scent of the lavender air freshener she bought last week. She put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine caught instantly, a low, steady, reliable hum. Olivia gripped the steering wheel. The leather was worn smooth where her hands rested. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. The dark circles under her eyes were gone. The frightened, shrinking woman who had stared at a coffee stain on a beige carpet a year ago was entirely erased. She shifted the car into drive. The tires gripped the concrete as she spiraled up the parking ramp, merging seamlessly into the bright, chaotic flow of city traffic. She didn't know exactly where she was going next. For the first time in a very long time, she was perfectly fine with that. The ultimate comeback. Olivia didn't just get even, she leveled up and built her own empire. If you loved watching Simon get exactly what he deserved and seeing Olivia take back her power, smash that like button, share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and subscribe for more deeply satisfying drama.